Welcome, everyone. Ljuds, bigegalla, helga kindir, merio mini möge hendalla. Eldkvöld, telkvöldsinnig, her not og nifter. Røgum augum litt tilsinnig og gevet sitt, jondum sigur. Hele eisig har ausinja, elsjå hin fålit til fål. Malog mandvit gevet ak amam, tremor likeness and medenlivum. Brandi brennuns buniner, funikveg is der funna mother of money, vers at maudikude en til dalske of dull. Flame is quickened by flame. A man from another man may become wiser, but from conceit may remain ignorant. Truth, like the skies above and beyond us all. Gods of our peoples and lands, may we spend this time together in friendship with you and with each other, and use it to the common good with profit and with pleasure. Tonight's thematic thread, Mithras, runs right through to the heart of our Indo-European heritage. And hosting this moot in London is particularly apposite, since the only pre-Christian temple one may visit in the capital today, as far as I'm aware, though reconstructed, is the Mithraeum. There's been a lot of interesting work done in the last 50 years in attempting to reconstruct Indo-European cosmogony, to integrate and project backwards in the quest to find some primordial story of how things came to be. One theory is that it was the killing in sacrifice of the first bovine, a cow such as Orthumla, as in the Edda, or a bull, as in this case, that established a proper relation between the divine and the human and led to the fecundity of creation. The ancient writer Porphyry saw the cave in which Mithras slew the bull as the cave of which Plato speaks, in order to teach us of the difference between the real and the mere shadow of it cast onto the cave's wall, facing which the unenlightened live captive, never having seen the sun. Mithraism was one of the classical world's most widespread and, in a way, most Northern European mystery cults, followed as it was by the soldiers who fought often on the fringes of the empire, and it is still charged with mystery. We do not know the details of how and why Mithras came to slay the bull, which is the central icon of worship, but we do know it meant something vital to the men who met together in the darkness to turn their devotion towards it and to gain strength thereby. Anything that can sustain those whose profession it is to face death and to be victorious seems to me still heavy with value to those of us who would wish to live in earnest. And with that, I very warmly invite Jason to speak. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, if you can come off mute, please.
Thank you, Sted. It's a pleasure to be with you again. As I suggested at the outset, what I'm planning to do is to give you a visual presentation that goes through the successive stages of Mithraism. And that's not only historical, but geographical, and shows the origins of Mithraism in ancient Iran, how it was promulgated into the Roman Empire. Then we'll go from pagan Rome into medieval Europe, then back to Iran to look at various forms of the survival of Mithraism following the collapse of the Roman Empire, survivals of Mithraism and reiterations of it in its cradle, which is ancient Iran. And then I'll conclude with a few remarks about crypto-Mithraism in Islamic Iran, how various forms of Mithraism are expressed in Shiite esotericism, which basically is the last historical form of Mithraism, and which, as you'll see, even from the first few slides that I'm going to present, is very much a occulted, albeit living tradition in a living, albeit occulted tradition in Iran today. So let me share screen and go into these slides. And then after this, maybe I'll give like a 5-minute summary of the doctrine of Mithraism as a whole, if we can form some kind of a synthesis historically and geographically. and then open it up to questions. So let's see if I can share a screen here and do a full screen presentation at the same time. Okay, do you all see this PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try to make this full screen. All right, let me get rid of my, actually, do you see the whole of this screen, or is it covered over by anything?
This seems fine. There's a picture of various read articles. Yeah, it looks fine, Jason.
Okay, so before I go into the various epochs in the history of Mithraism and the development of its doctrine, again, let me emphasize the fact that contrary to the prevailing view in Western academia, we are actually dealing here with a living religion, albeit one that's been occulted and that's taken a cryptic form, that's concealed itself in the folklore and folk traditions of the Iranian people. So the four major celebrations of Mithraism, the four major holy days or holidays of the Mithraic religion, namely the celebration of the solstices and the equinoxes, are still practiced in Iran to this day. And people often mistake these for Zoroastrian festivals, but in fact, these festivals far predate Zoroastrianism. They're Mithraic in origin. And these are the festivals of Yalda, which is basically what became Christmas, as we'll see when we talk about the promulgation of Mithraism into the Roman Empire, the winter solstice, Yalda, or the birth of Mithra, and then Nowruz, which is the spring equinox that has now become the New Year festival in Iran. Then you have a summer solstice celebration, which is called Tirgan, and we're going to see a relationship between the Tyr in Tirgan and the Norse Tyr. And then you have finally Mithrakana, or Mehragan, which features the name of Mithras himself in the name of the celebration, and that's the autumn festival. So these pictures here are of the Yalda altar, which is the celebration of the winter solstice and the birth of the light, the birth of Mithra as the light. And one thing I wanted to point out here is that on this pomegranates and other solar fruits like watermelons and so forth feature on this winter solstice altar. On this decorative pomegranate, there's a symbol which has become widely known as paisley in the West. And it's called bote in Iran. And the original meaning of this symbol, as is reflected in a contemporary stamp issued by the Iranian government, is that it's a bent cypress tree. Evergreens were worshipped by Mithraists. So the Christmas tree is a survival of the Mithraic reverence for the evergreen. And the type of evergreen that's most common in Iran is the cypress tree. The cypress tree signified truth in ancient Iranian culture, asha or arta, truth in the sense of what the Vedic religion referred to as rata in the oldest Sanskrit texts. And so the idea of a bent cypress tree is that in order not to break, in order to endure, the truth has to bend, which is an idea that has a certain relationship with the archetype of the trickster that we'll explore as we move forward. But in any case, the paisley symbol at its origin is a bent cypress tree, the idea of the dynamic capacity of the truth to bend and be adaptive. And I also think that this is the basis for the geometry of the Phrygian cap, which becomes an important symbol in Mithras. So this is the autumn equinox altar. And one facet of this autumn equinox celebration that is particularly noteworthy is that it involved the building of bonfires and the jumping over of purificatory fires, or fire walking in a sense, symbolic of a trial by fire. And these kinds of bonfires were often associated with the harvest and with the coming of autumn. And what wound up happening is that when the original New Year, which was this festival of Mithracana or Mehragan, was changed by Zoroastrians to the Nowruz celebration or the spring equinox, when the date of the new year was shifted, as the religion of Iran shifted from Mithraism to Zoroastrianism, aspects of this original autumn fire festival were grafted onto the celebration of Nowruz, so that on the last Wednesday of the year before Nowruz, there's this jumping over bonfires. And another part of that celebration is that people cover themselves in sheets and they bang on the walls of houses to exorcise demons and malevolent spirits from the houses. And these people covered in sheets, who represent the ghosts being exorcised from things and places, are offered sweets. So elements of what became the Samhain festival or Halloween are also traceable back to this original Mithraic autumn festival. I mentioned Nowruz. People, again, mistake Nowruz for a Zoroastrian holiday. It's not. If you look at the original symbolism of Nowruz, or the new day, it has to do with the ascension of a certain King Jamshid, Emperor Jamshid, into the heavens, with his throne being carried by devs or devas that he has bound into his service. And you'll notice again the bonfire here. So these people are celebrating around a bonfire as Jamshid's throne is lifted into the heaven by devs. As Mehran was mentioning before we started, the fundamental distinction between the Iranian and the Indian community is that the Iranians worship Ashuras or Ahuras, and they demonize the Devas who are worshipped by the Indians. Okay, so here we're seeing Devas subjugated by a king who is attaining Ahuric or Ashuric power, Titanic power. So it's a thoroughly Mithraic image. And this is a corollary to the Atlantis myth in Western civilization, in Greek culture, as we have it in its oldest form from Plato, because this Jamshid Shah and his whole civilization is punished by the Devas. There's basically a destruction of the world to punish the pride of this king who believed that humanity could ascend to godly power and basically storm the heavens. And interestingly enough, if you go into the Avesta, you see that the form that this destruction took in the homeland of the Aryans was not a flood, but it was a freezing over of the Aryan homeland, which, when we get to questions, we could go into maybe what that signifies and what part of the world this might have been that froze over rather than being flooded like the rest of the world was. In any case, this is a thoroughly Mithraic symbol, and it's what Nowruz is meant to commemorate. And I suspect that these 7 items on the Nowruz altar, which were later reinterpreted to signify the Amesha Spentas, or bounteous immortals in Zoroastrianism, the 7 bounteous immortals. Well, see, here's the thing is, there are 6 bounteous immortals in Zoroastrianism, and they're seen as emanations of Ahura Mazda, who the Zoroastrians claim is the 7th, right? But I think that there's an older symbolism that's been covered over by the Zoroastrians here, and that the 7 items on the Nowruz altar actually symbolize the 7 grades of initiation and the 7 planets in Mithraism, and that there's been a symbolic overwriting that's taken place here. We'll come to talking about the Achaemenids, the First Persian Empire, momentarily, but while we're on the subject of Nowruz, it's worth pointing out that Persepolis, the capital of the Achaemenid Empire, was referred to as Takht Jamshid by Iranians. And a lot of scholars have made the mistake of thinking that in Iran, it was forgotten that this place was called Parse by the ancient Persians, and that when Ferdowsi, the national poet of Iran in the medieval period, early medieval period, wrote his epic Shahnameh, and he talked about Jamshid Shah ascending into the heavens, Iranians looked at the titanic stature of this ancient site and they misnamed it the throne of Jamshid. I think this is a total fallacy. This site, if you ask me, was always called the throne of Jamshid esoterically, because the ground plan of Persepolis with all of the relief carvings on the wall is meant to symbolize the celebration of Nowruz. these people are bearing Nowruz gifts for the king. And Persepolis was never used as the political capital of the Persian Empire. It was an entirely ceremonial site. It was a religious site dedicated to the idea of Nowruz. So I think what the Achaemenids were trying to say was that the founding of the empire represented the attempt to regain Ahuric power, to reenact the feat of Jamshid Shah, who bound the Devas and forced them to serve his rise into the heavens as an equal to the divine powers. Okay, so the origins of Mithraism. You were talking about the primordial bull slaying, Stead, in your opening remarks, and coming out of Franz Cumont and some of the earlier scholars on Mithraism, there's been this sense that the bull slaying image, which we're going to talk about, in some depth, refers to the slaying of the primordial bull. In the Gathas of Zarathustra, which are the oldest writings of Zoroastrianism, and then subsequently in the Avesta, the Zoroastrian scriptures, you have an image of the primordial bull as, or cow, Gov, Gausha Urvan, they call it in Avestan, as sort of the primordial earth, or the mother earth goddess, or that form of life from which all other life springs. So the idea being that the slaying of this bull is a life-giving force, right? But here's the interesting thing, that in Zoroastrianism, Gaush Urvan actually cries out to the soul of Zarathustra for protection from the devas who are assailing her. And in particular, Ahriman is identified, the adversary, the figure that becomes the prototype for Satan, is identified as the one who slays the bull by Zoroastrians. So something bizarre is going on here in terms of Mithra subsequently being identified as a bull slayer, insofar as the slaying of the bull as a positive symbol of the earth was attributed to the diabolical power by Zoroastrians. There's some kind of inversion going on here. So let's go into what exactly that inversion was. In the Gathas of Zarathustra, you see basically Zarathustra develop this ingenious conceptual framework, which is unprecedented in its abstraction and sophistication. And basically what he says is that there are these two cosmic forces. One is a force of bounteous creation. It overflows as it forms energy in the cosmos, and this formed energy expresses an evolving divine intelligence. And this is what he calls Sepanta Minu, or Sepand Minu. And it's opposed by a constraining force, a force of constriction. The word angere in ancient Iranian is related to the current word for gere, or not, in Persian. So angere minu, the constraining mentality, is a counterforce on a cosmic scale that tries to restrict or constrain the creative power of Ahura Mazda, of the Lord of Wisdom, okay? And the other major innovation besides this conceptual abstraction of two cosmic forces at work in the world, rather than simply a pantheon of gods or demons, the other major innovation of Zarathustra is the idea that history is teleological. So there's a successive series of stages leading up to an end of history. And the battle between these two cosmic forces is teleological. It's going somewhere, right, towards an end of history. So the idea of chronological time is introduced here in a way that's unique. Now, long story short, this was a major disruption to the existing Mithraic religion of the Iranian people. And so there was pushback by the Mithraists, okay? And in particular, let me go back a little bit here. I this rate, we're never going to get through this presentation. All right. So there was pushback by the Mithraists. And what we're going to see happen is that the Mithraists reintroduce Mithra into this cosmology of the Zoroastrians in a way that attempts to repair the dualistic divide between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and deceit that Zarathustra is responsible for, okay? On the way to understanding how they do that, let me point out that Mithra in Persian and other Iranian languages is a name that's only given to women. Mithra is a feminine name. And the deeper you dig into the origins of Mithraism, and you look at even like accounts by Herodotus and other Greeks, you see that Mithra was worshipped in feminine form originally. And so this figure of Anahita, who is later identified as the, already by the Achaemenid period, identified as the mother and the consort of Mithra, was sort of a split off feminine aspect of Mithra himself. And the meaning of this rather scandalous myth that Mithra basically gives birth to himself by taking his mother as his consort, this kind of like, you know, Ouroboros kind of idea. The core meaning of that is the act of self-creation. So Mithra creates himself. Mithra is not created by any other deity. Mithra, in effect, brings himself into being. So to the extent that Mithra becomes an archetype for the perfect human being, the perfect human being is called to the act of self-creation, rather than being beholden to any creator beyond himself. This feminine aspect of Mithra that was split off as Anahita was depicted as Gorgon by the Scythians, who were, you know, the predominant Mithraists in the most archaic period of Mithraism. So they depicted her as a Gorgon. You know, the Gorgons that appear in Greek mythology are actually Scythian goddess figures, and they're led by effectively the feminine aspect of Mithra, who becomes Anahita in the culture of the ancient Persian Empire. And there's one other very prominent form of Mithra as a female, or of the goddess aspect of Mithra, and that is Artemis. So the name Artemis, first of all, the Greeks themselves say that Artemis was a goddess of the Sarmatians. The Sarmatians are an Iranian people. The Amazons of Greek mythology are the Sarmatian people, who are a tribe of Iranians closely related to the Scythians. And Artemis was their main deity. So the name Artemis has an etymology that makes sense in Iranian, okay? And that's Arta Amesha, the immortal truth. Arta Amesha in ancient Iranian would mean the immortal truth. So this, I think, is another iteration of Mithra, one that was particularly predominant in the Sarmatian culture. Mithra for the Scythians and the Sarmatians, the oldest people who worshipped Mithra, was a god of oaths and contracts. Mithra literally means bond or covenant, and it came to mean friend by extension of that. So, you know, a friend is one who you can trust and with whom you have a bond. So Mithra means bond, covenant, friend, and one of the oldest symbols of Mithraism, or let's say, rites that are characteristic of Mithraism, is the handshake or hand clasp, which you see here depicted in the investiture of Antiochus the investiture of Antiochus by Mithra, and also a shaking hands of a Mithraic king of Mithra with Hercules. And one thing that's worthy of note here is that Greeks like Herodotus said that there was a figure in Iran, in the Scythian culture, known as the Scythian Hercules. And we will come to this figure momentarily. He is known as Rostam in the Persian Book of Kings, in the Shahnameh. And the myths surrounding this Rostam figure are actually further keys to deciphering the meaning of certain esoteric symbols in Mithraism. These reliefs are from a site called Nimrud Dagh, which hopefully we'll have time to come back to. It's in Cappadocia, basically the part of Greater Kurdistan that's in Turkey today. And there's a number of Mithraic deities who are represented there. Okay, so Mithra, the god of oaths and contracts. The Iranians would swear by Mithra when they made an oath or a contract. And again, this is another Mithraic symbol. This kind of, taking an oath, right, is well attested in Mithraic sculptures from the Parthian period. And this is particularly significant because to get to the core of the issue here, to come to the heart of the matter, the way that the Mithraists attempted to begin to repair this dualism set up by Zarathustra is that they said that Mithra, as a god of oaths and contracts, sets himself up as the mediator between the two cosmic forces. So you have Ahura Mazda, the god of truth and light, and the cosmic creator, and then you have Ahriman, the force of deceit and darkness and derangement and constraint and so forth. And Mithra makes these two parties take an oath to abide by certain terms as they fight a cosmic war over successive epochs until the end of history. So he becomes the umpire or the judge or the mediator between the forces of good and the forces of evil, okay? And so what does that say about Mithra, if that's the case? What does it say about how this figure is positioned with respect to our conventional dualities of light and darkness, good and evil, and truth and deceit? Mithra was also associated with Mars. And Mars, or Ares, as he's called in Persian, Bahram, Verathragna in the most ancient Iranian languages, was an avatar of Mithra. So this is where you get the idea of Mithra as a war god, right? I mean, Mithra is the umpire in the cosmic war between the forces of light and darkness. Mithra is therefore also a god of war because he is presiding over the cosmic war. And in fact, the cosmic war in a way turns on him. He's the umpire. So Mars, depicted as a wild boar, Bahram, or Verathragna, was an avatar of Mithra, in particular in his guise as an avenger of those who are oath breakers, Payman Shekan. Those who are oath breakers will be avenged by Mithra in the form of Ares or Mars or Bahram. Okay? And the Scythian culture, which was the oldest matrix, the most primordial matrix for Mithraism, was an extremely warlike culture. These are people who would scalp their enemies. They would take the skulls of their enemies and dip them into metal and use them as drinking chalices. And they would actually drink Amanita muscaria laced wine from out of these drinking chalices, and also ale. And then the wine was later, by the way, actually, that was in the period of the Roman Empire. The earliest form of the soma drink was some other type of intoxicant laced with amanitas. And by the way, they were also heavily tattooed people. These are Scythian tattoos that someone's had reproduced from the archaeological evidence we found of Scythian bodies with tattoos on them. Okay, so they were a very shamanic people who had a lot of symbolism and customs in common with the Northern European so-called barbarians, the Germanic peoples, and we'll see how and why that's the case later on. Okay, but and these are the kurgans, the Scythian burial mounds. This is what it looked like on the inside of one of them, and you'll notice the conical pointed entryway into the kurgan is similar to the Scythian cap, which is also pointed, which becomes then the magician's cap in the West. And it's also the basis for the design of stupas. Buddhism evolved from out of the matrix of Scythian culture as well. And I've argued elsewhere, this is another subject that's covered in Iranian Leviathan. You can also refer to that text if you want an account of how the teaching of Siddhartha Gautama was actually coming from out of Scythian culture, and how basically Gautama was really a Scythian who settled in northern India. In any case, the Scythians would drink Amanita muscaria laced ale or some kind of intoxicant. And this color scheme of the Amanita on the forest floor underneath the evergreens, which were also revered by the Mithraists, becomes the basis for the flag designs for all of the countries that were once Mithraic. If you look at the flag designs of Iran, Kurdistan, Tajikistan, Bulgaria. Bulgaria was originally the homeland of the Sarmatians. Even Hungary, which later was occupied by Turkic Huns, was, you know, part of the Sarmatian heartland. So these countries in their color scheme preserve the significance of the Amanita in original Mithraic culture. And, you know, the riding outfit of the Scythians, which was completely unknown to classical Europe, not unknown, but it was not common in classical Europe, right? I mean, the Romans and the Greeks went around in togas. This riding outfit with, you know, a vest bound by a belt over pants with riding boots and so forth, and particularly in the red color that was significant for Mithraists, and with this Phrygian cap as headgear. This survives today in the garments of Santa Claus. And, you know, these reindeer that carry the sleigh for Santa Claus, these were magical animals to the Scythian Mithras. They depicted reindeer all over their gold crafts work. And I think that this is a symbol for, you know, transcendent and ecstatic flight through Amanita intoxication. And more about this subject is in this book, Mushrooms, Myth, and Mithras. It talks about the significance of psychotropic drugs to the Mithras cult. Okay, so Mithra as the umpire between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Another way in which the Mithraists attempted to repair the dualism set up by Zarathustra is that they said, look, this chronological time that the cosmic war is taking place over the course of is really an emanation or a degeneration from a primordial time, which is not chronological, okay? And they called this Zorvan. It's basically the idea of Kronos or Saturn. And they said that Ormazd and Ahriman, Ahura Mazda and his adversary, were twins born of the primordial Lord of Time. So here you see a very ancient Iranian pre-Achaemenid engraving that shows the Devas on the one side of Zorvan and the Ahuras or Ashuras on the other side of Zorvan. With, you know, Zorvan basically handing over power to Ahriman, the leader of the Devas or Devs on the one hand, and giving investiture to Ahura Mazda on the other hand. And this Zorvan was considered an androgynous deity. So Zorvan had, again, a feminine aspect and a masculine aspect. And the feminine aspect within Zorvan, which is the face underneath the bearded head, that was referred to as Oz or concupiscence. It was like a primordial desire. So the idea was that Zorvan, the god of time, was profoundly unconscious, was like abyssally unaware of himself. And he is seduced by the Oz, by the concupiscence within himself, sort of hypostatized as a semi-autonomous being. He is seduced into a premature birth of Ahriman. And then the other twin, Ormazd, is born secondarily. So the world is in the first place delivered over to evil. And then the good twin, Ahura Mazda, the force of light and truth and order, is born secondarily and carries out a remedial function, okay? So this is the myth that the Mithraists developed as an answer to Zoroastrian dualism. And it's really a myth that signifies being beyond good and evil. The being both of the supreme deity beyond good and evil, and also becoming free from dualistic morality and this kind of dichotomous thought through the process of divinization. So I think that if you look at Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the second coming of Zarathustra that Nietzsche portrays in that text is really the coming of a Mithraic Zarathustra, who is critiquing the dualism of the historical Zarathustra. Zorvan later on was depicted in this form, adopting some of the iconography of the Gorgons, which again goes back to Scythian culture. And you see also the serpent wound around him, her, this androgynous being. A really good resource for understanding the significance of Zorvan in Iranian thought is this book, Zorvan, A Zoroastrian Dilemma by Zahner. And I think that one of the major deficits in Western scholarship on Mithraism is that they do not situate the cosmology and metaphysical theology of Roman Mithraism in a context like the one that's presented by Zahner in this book on Zorvan, okay? So until you do that, you can't understand, for example, what the bull slaying means. In this book, The Origins of the Mithraic Mysteries, Ulansey talks about this bull slaying symbol in the context of the precession of the equinoxes. And I think he's quite right, but he doesn't make the connection back to Zorvan in a way that I think prevents him from seeing the big picture. Okay, so what does this cryptic image really mean? It's true that the Scythians used to carry out raids where they would go and basically capture the cattle of a sedentary population. And their religion, their form of archaic Mithraism was a sacrificial religion. So were cattle seized and sacrificed? Sure, they were. But that's not what this symbol really means. This symbol is the overcoming of the age of Taurus by the age of Aries. And we know that because, well, we know it for a number of reasons. I mean, the devil's in the detail. You have to go back to these scholarly texts to really understand, all the pieces of evidence for it. But one way that this becomes very evident in terms of the symbology of Iranian culture is that the swastika in Iranian civilization is called Gardunei Mehr, or the Wheel of Mithra. Why would the swastika be called the Wheel of Mithra? The bear constellations around the pole star at various times of the year, form the shape of a swastika. And the idea was that Mithra, as the umpire, as the mediator between the forces of light and darkness, okay, the twins who are born of the primordial time god, Mithra, as the mediator between these forces, can ascend like King Jamshid to the celestial sphere and overpower the god of time, namely Zorvan, by grabbing the heavens at the wheel around the pole star and shifting the entire celestial sphere. This is how the precession of the equinoxes was understood symbologically by Mithraists. So the 12 constellations and the 7 visible planets were seen as fatalistic forces. They had a kind of archontic power over human beings, right? And so they are effectively mediators of Zorvan's control over man, right? This Kronos, this time god, makes us puppets of his stellar fatalism. And the way to freedom and self-determination is to ascend above the celestial sphere and to grab the heavens, as it were, by their wheel and become the person who turns the world and thereby shifts the age and brings a new age, brings a new heaven and a new earth, okay? Effectively a new world order. And so what we're seeing in this symbol of the bull slaying is the age of Taurus being overcome by the age of Aries. Again, Aries, Mars, was the avatar of Mithra, as a way of symbolizing the turning of Mithra's wheel and the power over fate and the capability to make one's own destiny. So that's my interpretation of the core image of Mithraism. And I'll confess here that this is the meaning of the Mithraic myth that I encoded in this symbol that I designed for Prometheism. What I really intended with this design was to signify the turning of the wheel of Mithra and the transition between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. So this is actually a thoroughly Mithraic symbol. And it's not incidental that I used it for a movement that I've called Prometheism, because if you actually look very carefully at the statue of Prometheus at Rockefeller Center, you'll notice that he is rising above the sphere of the 12 constellations, okay? There is this ring of the ecliptic branded by the symbols of the zodiacal constellations, and this Prometheus figure who's carrying fire is rising up and beyond this ring of the ecliptic, right? And this association, I think Manship was the sculptor of this, is not arbitrary. The Greeks and the Persians both associated Perseus with Mithra. They said Perseus and Mithra were the same figure at a certain point in Hellenistic history. And they said that Perseus stole fire from the gods and brought it down to the realm of mortals and set up the order of the Magi as guardians of the perpetually burning flame. So there are aspects of the iconography of Mithra, who again is a Titan, which align very closely with the symbolism of the cult of Prometheus, who again is a fire-bearing Titan. And so, that's why I chose this as a symbol of Prometheism. All right, so you have this Mithraic response to Zoroastrianism, and this is not only on an ideological level, it's also on a political and a military level. This conflict between Zoroastrianism and Mithraism exploded in northeastern Iran at the period where the Median kingdom reached the edge of the Scythian realm. So the Scythians are up here in Central Asia and in the Caucasus, and at a certain point, round about 600 BC, the Median kingdom pushed up to the borders of the Scythian realm, and the Medes in this area had adopted Zoroastrianism and were becoming crusaders for it, and they sent out in particular the king who was Zarathustra's patron, Shah Goshtas, or Kavi Vishtaspa, sent out a crusader champion, his son Esfandiar, to convert the Scythians forcibly to Zoroastrianism. And this is where you get in the Iranian national epic the story of Rostam and Esfandiar, where a Scythian champion, Rostam, goes to battle against this crusader for Zoroastrianism. And in this battle, he is assisted by his father, who's a Mithraic magician, who calls upon this figure, this Simurgh, to teach him how to create certain magical arrows that slay the crusader, the Zoroastrian crusader, Esfandiar. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because if you look at, and Rostam was from here, he was from the Indo-Scythian kingdom. He was from an area in southeastern Iran known as Karmania, or because the local language vacillates between K and G are alternate in the dialect of this area, it was known as Kermania or Germania, and also as Sakastana or Sistan. So this guy, Rostam, who is uber Viking, uber Norse in his appearance, in the iconography of him. This guy comes up to fight against the Zoroastrian crusaders, and he calls upon this magical bird of his sorcerer father to help him to defeat this crusader. And the symbolism of this bird originally is that it has a wolf's head, wings, and a serpentine body. And so this Simor, I think, is connected to the symbolism of Fenrir in Norse mythology. Why do I say that? Because Fenrir, because Tyr, as he's attempting to bind Fenrir, swears with his right hand, right, which is bitten off by Fenrir, and Fenrir is subsequently, bound until Ragnarok, the end of the world. And so Tyr is left with which hand? If Tyr is swearing by his right hand, what hand is this hero left with? This hero, this champion, who is identified by the Greeks, as Ares, and by the Romans as Mars, just like Mithra is. He's left with his left hand if his right hand is bitten off by Tyr. The designation left hand path in the Indo-Aryan tradition refers to the path of worshiping the Asuras or Ahuras rather than the Devas. Okay, it's an inversion of Orthodox Vedic religion. And Mithra, like Prometheus, is an Ashura. And so I think that somewhere encoded in this symbolism of Fenrir biting the right arm of Tyr is an understanding of the Mithraic figure as the bringer of the left-hand path. And interestingly, we have this name Tyr in Persian as well. It survived in the Iranian tradition as the arrow that's let loose by Ares, the archer. Arash, or as the Greeks would pronounce it, Ares, is a Mithraic figure who is famous for having loosed a magical arrow that defined the boundaries of the Aryan realm, or Aryana Kashatra, Iran Shah. And so the arrow of Arash is called Tyr, which is, of course, the rune for Tyr. I don't think this is an incidental connection. And this Tyr, which was associated with the dog star, again evoking Fenrir, this Tyr is the figure most closely associated with Tyrgon, or the summer solstice, when people pray basically for the coming of rain. They pray to the dog star for the coming of rain. So again, you have a Tyr, an association with a canine. And finally, if you look at the Norse myths, Fenrir, the unbinding of Fenrir at Ragnarok is closely associated with his father, Loki. And the serpentine symbolism associated with Loki is also closely associated with Mithra in Mithraism. So the Mithra basically is an archetype that precedes the kind of differentiation we see in the Norse religion between Tyr and Loki. It's as if the god of truth and justice and oaths, Tyr, and the trickster figure, Loki, have been split off by the Norse branch of the Indo-European family from a more primordial archetype, Mithra, who is both a god of truths and oaths and contracts, and also a trickster figure associated with the powers of darkness. And I suggest that, this is not a later synthesis of these two different figures in a perverse way, but it's the more primordial form that's been sort of dissociatively differentiated by the Norse, because Mitra Varuna occurs in the oldest Sanskrit texts. okay, and as an Ashura opposed to the Devas. So the left-hand path, I think, is really as old as that. That it was present in the Aryan tradition from the beginning, and you can see it reflected in this myth of Fenrir, who is a figure that binds together Tyr and Loki. So the serpent symbolism that you see in Loki is really closely associated with Mithra through the synthesis of Mithra with Nergal. Nergal was the god of the underworld in the Assyrian and Babylonian culture. And even before the founding of the first Persian Empire, you had the synthesis of the cult of Mithra on the part of the Medes with the cult of Nergal. So as the Medes took over, the Babylonian and Assyrian world, they identified Nergal with Mithra. And this reemerges again in the Iranian national epic in the figure of Zahak. Zahak is this king who has two serpents sprouting from his shoulders. And he is a black magician whose serpents are said to feed on human brains, meaning that basically he is a perverter of people's thoughts. And from a Zoroastrian perspective, of course, that would be true if we're dealing with a Mithraic magician. So the Zahak figure is a reiteration of this dark aspect of Mithra as identified with Nergal, who was, again, the god of war. So Nergal is the Mars Aries figure. And I think that the two serpents emerging from the shoulders of Zahak, which presumably are wound around his spinal column inside his body, are meant to signify the caduceus, which is a serpentine mace. Zahak has his skull crushed by a hero, Fereydun, using a bull-headed mace. Who is the bull slayer? Mithra is the bull slayer. The bull-headed mace is being used to crush the skull of the guy who has the king who has the serpents emerging from his shoulders. I think the caduceus is the mace of Zahak, or the mace of Mithra, and you see it right here in the symbolism of the first grade of initiation in Mithraism, the caduceus, together with the raven. The other god that Mithra was associated with when the Medes took over the culture of the Babylonians and the Assyrians was Shamash. Shamash was the god of truth and justice and the solar deity of Mesopotamia. And this symbol of the Farbahar on the right-hand side here in gold that you see, which becomes emblematic for Mithraism and then later for Zoroastrianism, is modeled on the iconography of Shamash. So the symbolism of Shamash and Nergal are mixed together in the Mithraism of the Median period. And from out of that, we get the icon of the lion and the sun, which to this day is the Iranian national symbol. Okay, so basically this symbol, which has been, cryptically reinterpreted as all kinds of things up to and including Imam Ali in Shiaism, this is basically Nergal and Shamash symbolism appropriated by Mithraists to basically depict Mithra. Okay, the lion and the sun is a very archaic depiction of Mithra. All right, how are we time-wise, Ted? Because I'm realizing that this could actually be a series of talks rather than one talk. How are we time-wise?
Jason, it's entirely up to you. I mean, if you've got a lot of material and you would prefer to do it in two parts, everyone will be very pleased to listen to you again. It's entirely up to you.
How long have we gone for, though? I can't see the clock here. What has it been? Half an hour?
No, I mean it's not an hour. It's just over three quarters. I mean, I think
you've gone for what, 45 minutes already?
Just over 45 minutes. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay. Well. All right. Let me. How are you with doing this in two parts?
I think that's. I mean, what you said is absolutely fascinating. I don't think anyone would want to miss anything. I don't think we would like to, if you to start cutting things out, because visually and intellectually, it's so stimulating. So, I mean, maybe go on for a bit longer and see how much more time you'd need. I mean, doing it in 2 sessions would perhaps be you know, a good
Okay.
idea.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So look, one of the worst distortions of history, I think, that's taken place in Iranian studies, but then particularly in the broader social movement to revive the culture of ancient Iran, is the distortion of claiming that the Achaemenids, the rulers of the first Persian Empire, were Zoroastrians. I've really dug into this. Again, you know, there's an in-depth study of this in Iranian Leviathan. There is no evidence whatsoever that the founder of Imperial Iran was a Zoroastrian. Cyrus the Great doesn't refer to Ahura Mazda or to Zarathustra anywhere. He has a Mithraic solar lotus inscribed on his tomb. He gives instructions for a horse sacrifice to take place at his tomb once every month. Sacrifices of animals in general are prohibited by Zoroastrians, and you know, so there's no way that a Zoroastrian, an adherent Zoroastrian emperor, would mandate a monthly horse sacrifice at his tomb. Moreover, Cyrus the Great went around his empire building temples to Anahita, the consort and the mother of Mithra, and his investiture was in the temple of Anahita, and subsequently the crowning of all of the Haqemenid kings took place in temples to Anahita. So I don't see how anyone, you know, could claim that this man was anything other than a Mithraist. And then when we get to his successors, such as Darius the Great nominally uses the name of Ahura Mazda in his various inscriptions. But if you look at how the man came to power, he was a consummate schemer. We see this in numerous Greek accounts from Herodotus and others, that basically, to make a long story short, he used, as a military officer who was not a blood descendant of Cyrus, Darius used numerous stratagems and duplicitous tactics in order to attain power. And then he carried out a military coup d'etat and the suppression of 19 rebellions across the country, again, employing tactics that depart very drastically from any kind of Orthodox Zoroastrian ethics. In particular, he lies about having killed this figure Gomata, quote unquote, who ruled the empire for about 6 months after the death of Cyrus the Great. He actually let this guy go. And as I argue in Iranian Leviathan, this Gomata or Gotama, who was a Scythian magus, winds up in northern India under a false identity and becomes Gotama Sakamuni, the Scythian sage Gotama. And the reason Darius does that is because Darius actually philosophically identifies with certain aspects of the teaching of Gotama, which are very Mithraic in nature. But he thinks that this man would be ruinous as an emperor. He ought to be given a second lease on life as a philosopher. And in Iranian Leviathan, I draw an extensive comparison between the fragments of Heraclitus and the oldest teachings that are attributable to Gotama, and argue that the fact that Darius the Great extended an invitation to Heraclitus of Ephesus to come be the court philosopher of the Achaemenids shows that he had a philosophical motivation for sparing Gotama's life, despite his extremely brutal treatment of the other rebels. So this man employs noble lies and stratagems to come to power, and he does it on the basis of a Mithraic philosophy that you see also reflected in the fragments of Heraclitus. Heraclitus, who took refuge where? In the temple of Artemis at the end of his life. So Artemis, again, was an Amazon goddess of the Iranian Sarmatians, who represents the split-off feminine aspect of Mithra. And here's the tomb of Darius the Great. So I don't think that Darius the Great was a Mithraist either. I mean, was a Zoroastrian either. He was a Mithraist. Again, he was a military man as well. So, you know, he's coming from out of the Mithraic culture of the Iranian military. the next major figure in the Achaemenid dynasty, Xerxes, certainly wasn't a Zoroastrian, despite however many times he may evoke Ahura Mazda on his inscriptions. This man actually carried out human sacrifices on the way into Greece. You know, not only was he sacrificing animals, he was actually engaging in some of the darkest practices associated with the Nergal cult that had been assimilated into Mithraism. And there are other reasons I could give for that as well. But this is another Mithraic leader in the Achaemenid period. So the idea that the Achaemenids were Zoroastrians is let's just say it's a historical inaccuracy. And so when we see Mithraism emerge as the dominant ideology and theology of Parthian Iran, it's not that somehow Zoroastrianism has been replaced by Mithraism. It's just that, you know, the more archaic form of Iranian religion has dispensed with these sort of useful, pragmatic employments of Zoroastrian theology. Okay, and one thing that shattered that kind of topical Zoroastrian, that kind of topical adherence to Zoroastrianism and the promulgation of a nominally Zoroastrian discourse was, of course, the Greek colonization of Iran for 150 years, you know, from the time of Alexander on through the various generals of his who divided up the empire, particularly General Seleucus, who took most of Iran. And so you can imagine how if a Greek polytheistic pagan culture is basically colonizing Iran, how a more pagan figure like Mithra would come back into prominence. And it's in this period where the identification of Mithra with Perseus became particularly significant. In fact, the Parthian Mithraists, this is one of the symbols of the grades of initiation, the symbol of the grade of the Persian in the 7 grades of Mithraic initiation. The 5th grade has the harpy sword of Perseus as one of its symbols. And you see that this identification of Perseus with Mithra becomes so significant to the Parthians that they have the Pegasus printed on one side of their coins. The various Mithridates or Mehrdad, the kings given by Mithra. Mehrdad means given by Mithra or Mithra's justice. And the various Mithridates or Mehrdad have the Pegasus on their coins. And Mithridates I, the founder of the Mithraic empire of the Parthians, which becomes the dominant rival of Rome, the predominant rival of Rome, this leader sets up something called the fleet of the Cilician pirates in the Eastern Mediterranean. And he uses this as a black ops navy against the Roman Empire. So it's commonly believed that Mithraism spread into the Roman Empire because Roman soldiers fighting against Iranians underwent some kind of conversion experience, maybe some kind of Manchurian candidate style psychological manipulation at the hands of Iranian captors. I'm sure that some of that took place, but that actually was not the main conduit for the spread of Mithraism from Iran into the Roman Empire. The main conduit were the Cilician pirates who were operating as a black ops navy for Mithridates I. And the reason they adopted the skull and the crossbones as their standard is that it's a reference to, again, this overcoming of the Lord of time and fate. The crossed bones are supposed to be separated by 23 degrees, which are the number of degrees separating the celestial equator from the ecliptic. And so the head over the crossed bones is death's head. It's the head of time, which for us means death, until and unless we can turn the wheel of Mithra and overcome celestial fate and become the masters of our own destiny. Okay, so that's where the skull and the crossbones symbol came from, as first flown by the Cilician pirates. And then it wound up on poison bottles because Mithridates VI, who set up a kingdom on the Black Sea at Pontus, Mithridates VI, who's depicted here on the right side in the cover of Adrian Mayer's book, was infamous for his use of poison to assassinate his enemies. Okay, this guy was Rome's deadliest rival, and he was a Mithraist and associated with the Cilician pirates, and he used poison as his predominant method of assassination. So this is how the skull and the crossbones wound up identified with poison.
Jason, I've had lots of people put messages in chat saying yes to a second session. I was just thinking, I mean, we've gone on for over an hour, and we're just about to enter the Roman Empire. Whether this might be a good time to halt for another session, I don't know. I don't know
Sure.
the extent of your
We can
material.
do that. We can do that. Let me open it up to questions, and we will reconvene for a second session whenever it's convenient.
Yes, I think that might be a good thing. I mean, what sort of time? I mean, when would suit you for part 2?
It's probably better for us to do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
When is your meetings are always on Wednesdays, or like?
They don't have to be. They can be on Wednesdays or Sunday afternoons. Would next Wednesday be appropriate for you?
Next Wednesday actually doesn't work, which is why I was asking. I can do next Thursday afternoon, though. Does that work for you?
I think probably earlier not actually, but okay.
Maybe the weekend then. Maybe at some point in the weekend.
Yeah.
We'll coordinate it at some point in the next week and a half or so. We'll schedule a second session.
Yeah, I think that is a good idea, because obviously you put a lot of work into the presentation, and these ideas are still very much with you, so it'd be good to do it then. Okay, well, I was looking forward to this, but it's vastly exceeded what I was expecting. So many of these ideas are totally new to me, and I expect to many other people. But yeah, let's open things to questions. I'm sure many people will wish to say something. Perhaps anyone who wishes could raise a hand, or oh yeah, Frank, Father Frank, yeah, please go ahead and unmute, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was fascinated by your initial reference to how Mithras actually survives in the Share tradition. Can you say a little more about that? Because I'm, I have lots of contacts with Shiism, so I would love to know more.
Sure. So, I cover this in the latter parts of my presentation, so we'll wind up coming back to it, hopefully in a second session. Hopefully we won't need a third session. But long story short, here's what happened, okay? This is a terrible travesty of a condensation, okay? But bottom line up front, this is what happened. The Sassanids, who were the second Persian Empire, right, who displaced the Parthians. The Parthians were not Persians. They were Iranians, but they were Scythians. And they were quintessential Mithraists, these Parthians, right? So when the Sassanids overthrew the Parthians, they basically persecuted Mithraism. And there was a massive Mithraic revolt against the Sassanids, a revolt that was led by a figure called Mazdak, who actually became the prime minister of the king Kavad I. Now, as you can expect, after a certain period where they were successful with various programs, they were themselves massacred, and their movement was forced underground. Okay, so these Mithraists, led by Mazdak, round about the late 500s, they were in the 500s, were forced underground by the Sassanid king Khosrow Anushiravan. And when the Sassanid state is destroyed by the invading Arabs and a black hole, a vacuum of power, opens in Iran, the Mithraists of Parthian descent, particularly in the north of the country, in Hyrcania and in Khorasan, re-emerge to establish semi-autonomous fiefdoms. And what you see happen is initially a revolt of Mithraists like Babak, Afshin, Mazyar, and so forth, against the government of the Arabian Caliphate and against the Muslim religion. But then once these Mithraic revolts in their pure form are defeated by the forces of the Caliphate, actually, to tell the truth, not by the Arabian Caliphate, but by the Turks who adopt the Caliphate and make it their own. Once these initial Mithraic revolts are defeated, the Mithraists in that northern part of Iran attempt to preserve Mithraism in an esoteric and occulted form under the cloak of Islam. And you can draw a direct connection genealogically between Mazdakism, between the form of Mithraism that revolted against the Sassanid state under the leadership of Mazdak. You can draw a direct line between that and Shiite esotericism through the movement of Babak Khurramdin in Hyrcania and Azerbaijan, and through the various other Mithraic cults that arose in Khorasan in opposition to the Sunni Arab Caliphate. And we see the Mithraic substructure of these types of so-called Shi'ism revealed very clearly in the Order of Assassins. So the Ismaili sect of the Sevener Shi'isms, whose seven symbolism again goes back to the 7 grades of initiation and the 7 planets in Mithraism. The Sevener Shiites, or the Ismailis, fight a resistance battle against the Turks and the Mongols. And in their form of Shi'ism, I mean, basically the esoteric is revealed very nakedly. And they have all kinds of heretical beliefs and practices which are not Muslim in any orthodox sense, like the belief in reincarnation, their understanding of the nature of truth, and their account of the relationship between exoteric scriptures and esoteric initiatory truth that's passed on through the ages, and so on and so forth. So hopefully, when we do the second session, we can come around to that. And in fact, my entire presentation ends with the figure of Shah Ismail Safavi, and shows how Shah Ismail, the founder of the Safavid dynasty, which institutionalized Shiaism as the national religion of Iran, Shah Ismail himself was a Kurd who was initiated into Mithraism in the forests of Hyrcania before he wound up founding the Safavid dynasty.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was quite an answer. Superb. Michael from London, please unmute yourself and.
All right. I just have 2 questions. I enjoyed your talk. Really complex and intricate, but very interesting. Did I understand you identify Perseus with Prometheus? That's one question. And the other is, how would you explain the reversal of the Asuras or Hers from the Indian, Hindu, Vedic understanding of the Devas and Asuras?
Right. So clearly, in Greek mythology, Prometheus and Perseus are completely distinct figures. However, there is an association of Perseus with Mithra, both by the Greeks and also in Greek folk religion, because see, in Greek folk religion, there's this idea that of the union of Perseus and Andromeda was born Perses, who becomes the patriarch of the Persians. Okay, and the Parthians said that Perseus, one of his heroic deeds was that he stole fire from the heavenly sphere, brought it down to earth, and he set up the order of the Magi to be the guardians of the ever-burning fire. So what I'm suggesting is that there is a commonality between Mithra and Prometheus on the basis of these associations of Mithra with Perseus. Okay, so the ways in which there was an attempt to syncretize Perseus and Mithra involves fire-stealing symbolism that you see also in the cult of Prometheus. Now, I would say, though, that there's a much more primordial and even more intimate relationship between Prometheus and Mithra himself, to the point where I would have to wonder, and this brings us to your other question, I would have to wonder whether they're the same figure. So, you know, Mitra Varuna occurs in the oldest Sanskrit texts, together with Indra. So if you look at the oldest strata of the Vedas, you have Indra, who's the leader of the Devas, and then you have Mitra Varuna, who is the leader of the Ashuras, or Ahuras.
Mhm.
And this Varuna in Persian becomes Baruna, and Barun means rain. So Anahita, the feminine aspect of Mithra, was a goddess of the waters. And in the summer solstice celebration, Tirgan, there are prayers for rain, right? Prayers to the dog star for rain. So it appears that the Vedic Aryans already understood Mithra as androgynous, as having a male aspect, namely Mithra, and the Varuna female or Baruna female aspect. And this figure, Mitra Varuna or Mithra Anahita, is set at odds against Indra. Okay, now who's Indra? Indra is Zeus. Indra is clearly Zeus. He's the thunderbolt throwing sky father god. And who does Prometheus revolt against? Zeus. So I think that Prometheus and Mithra are both iterations of some kind of are vastly archaic adversary figure in the Aryan tradition. And that from the beginning, just as there was a right-hand path, the right hand of, Tyr that's put into the mouth of Fenrir, just as there was a right-hand path, there was also a left-hand path, which was the Ahuric or Ashuric path. So that would be my answer.
Do we actually know that Tyr put his right hand into the mouth of Fenrir? I mean, if he's going to be tying up the wolf, it seems like he would be needing his right hand. And if you were actually offering something, you'd offer your weaker hand.
Yeah, but he's taking an oath, and so you would never swear an oath by your left hand.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, he was putting his hand into the wolf's mouth as a pledge. Therefore, I'm sure the wolf would have felt shortchanged if he put his left hand in, maybe.
But he could still have made his oath with his right hand as he was placing his left hand into the mouth of the wolf. But all right, but
Yeah,
it's a finer point.
no, it's a good question. Is that Mehran? Are you raising your finger? Do you have a question? Yeah, please unmute. Please unmute.
Wonderful show. Many thanks, and I hope that there will be more.
I can't hear his audio. Can you speak up a bit?
Okay. Do you hear me now? Great. As I said, many thanks. I had many questions, some comments. I hope you will address them later in future sessions. But I wonder about this Leo grade, the fourth, and how it could be related to this Zorban. I mean, we have to load these grades with relevant, relevant questions, and they need to be brought into our time. So in that reason, I find this Leo as the broker, the intermediator between the three first grades and the three latest. Maybe we'll address them in the future sessions. I mean, this Persian and this Sul Invictus, I mean, this, invincible son and this father. Isn't it about Ahura Mazda, the Messiah, and the Magi's? This is this trinity which you can see in the last grades. And then you have, this Leo figure, somehow, the creature of some kind of mind this, spirituality and the body, those three first grades. So I want you to explain the role of Leo, if it is Zorban, and what that can mean, and also how Mithraism could be related to the zodiac, so that we can, bring Mithraism in the mainstream, mindset of our time. That's my very concern. Thank you.
Let me give a very provisional short response to that, and then a promissory note that in the next session, I'll give you my interpretation of the 7 grades of initiation in Mithraism, which is somewhat unconventional interpretation, but one that's very coherent compared to most of the speculations that have been ventured by scholars. So my provisional short answer is that the grade of Leo comes after the grade of the soldier. And so, okay, I mean, how to say this without going into the interpretation of the grades before that, but basically the grades before the grade of the soldier are initiations that are meant to ensure that you can face the prospect of your death courageously, that you can face death, that you can lose your ego, which is something beyond merely facing death, because you could be reconciled to the prospect of your death while remaining egotistical. And the second grade of initiation is actually dying to your ego. The grade of the bride is an overcoming of the ego. And then the grade of the soldier is the idea of being able to have the backbone to fight for something, but in a way where you're a foot soldier, where you're capable of perfect discipline and submission to an order, right, from above. The grade of the lion, of Leo, comes after that, after the grade of the soldier. And so I think that this is related to the meaning of the term Shir Mardon in Persian, which goes from the Mithraic tradition then into esoteric Shiaism, and it's used to describe Imam Ali and so forth. Shir Mardon, and you can also call someone a Shir Zan or a lioness, is a person who is not a foot soldier, but a hero, a champion, a chivalric knight. It's someone who's a commander on the battlefield and not just a person who follows orders. So that's my interpretation of the meaning of the grade of Leo. But again, I'll go into this at length in the next session.
Right, thanks very much for that answer, Jason. I think Michael from
the
Cologne.
zodiac, also the
Oh,
zodiac.
sorry. Yeah, please.
Any thoughts about that? Mithraism and zodiac.
Yeah, the long story short, the 12 constellations of the zodiac, together with the 7 planets and the sun and the moon, Sol and Luna. Okay, the sun and the moon were actually not, what I'm about to say is actually not true of the sun and the moon. Let's leave them aside. But the 12 constellations of the zodiac and the 7 visible planets were all seen as instruments of Zorvan for the fatalistic control of human life. So the point is to be able to overcome these astrological influences that move you through your passions. In Mithraism, there was an association between the passions that thoughtlessly move human beings and astral influences. And the task was to be able to become more capable of free choice and self-determination by overcoming Zorvan together with his entire sphere of constellations. Again, that's the grabbing of the wheel of Mithras, namely the swastika, and having power over the sphere of Zorvan.
Yeah, very well put. Michael from Cologne, could I have your question, please, if you can unmute?
Thank you very much, Ted. First of all, I'd like to say I'm quite overwhelmed by that performance, so congratulate you. I sometimes do readings myself, but I feel myself quite like a weed because I have to read from a paper when it's in that much detail. So congratulations, I greatly appreciated that. My question is, you mentioned rather briefly sacrifice in the Mithraism. What exactly was the nature of that sacrifice? What was the purpose of it? And the thing that slightly surprises me is that you mentioned in Zoroastrianism there is a rejection of sacrifice of animals, but of course there's a strong tradition of sacrifice in the Semitic religions. And from what you said, I sort of understood that Zoroastrianism with its Manichaeism was closer to the Semitic religions, but in this case of sacrifice, therefore not. So sort of perhaps two questions, but certainly one question, if you could elaborate on how sacrifice works.
Let me take the second question first. So first of all, Zoroastrianism has nothing to do with Semitic anything, okay? I mean, it is an Uber-Aryan, extremely abstract cosmological religion, right? I mean, Zarathustra can rightly be characterized, as I characterize him in Iranian Leviathan, as the first philosopher. Zarathustra, you know, as best as I can determine, was about 600 BC, right at the fountainhead of the thinkers we refer to as pre-Socratics. So we go from Zarathustra to Anacharsis of Scythia to people like Heraclitus of Ephesus and so forth, okay? So Zarathustra, his theology is so abstract and conceptual that, you know, you could really see it as the beginning of philosophy. And its matrix is entirely Indo-European. There's nothing Semitic about it whatsoever. And, you know, again, you're right. Religion doesn't involve sacrifice. Now, in terms of sacrifice and Mithraism, there's no simple answer to that, right? Because Mithraism is a historical phenomenon that evolved over various epochs. And so in the most archaic form of Mithraism practiced by the Scythians, there were literal sacrifices. I mean, they would sacrifice various animals, like captured cattle, for example. They would also sacrifice humans. The Scythians, and we'll come to this in the second part, the Scythians would set up a sword on a stone altar, which it was going to become the basis for the symbol of the sword and the stone, and the whole mythos of the sword and the stone. They would plant a sword in a stone altar, which they would worship as a symbol of Mithra, and they would sacrifice their enemies, captured enemies, to this sword and pour the blood of their enemies over this sword, okay? So there were all kinds of sacrifices in archaic Mithraism as practiced by the Scythians, including human sacrifice. When the Medians and the Achaemenids incorporated the cult of Nergal into Mithraism, they are incorporating a Semitic underworld cult that involves all kinds of, let's just say, ethically problematic, you know, morally dubious types of sacrifice, all right? Sacrifice is intended to give you power over the underworld, okay? And to connect you to the shadow realm and to the ultimately shadow sides of your own psyche. And so all of the underworld cult sacrifices of Nergal were incorporated into Mithraism, and we see them being practiced by even Xerxes as he enters into Europe, you know, on his campaign to conquer Greece. He actually sacrifices a number of male and female virgins. Okay, so the guy certainly wasn't a Zoroastrian. Now, later in Parthian Mithraism and in the kind of Mithraism that enters the Roman Empire, I think sacrifice takes on a much more spiritual meaning, where it's the idea of sacrificing one's own ego and being capable of sacrificing oneself as a martyr in the cosmic war, in the spiritual battle. So I think that there is I don't know, you could call it sublimation of the idea of sacrifice from you know, more tangible expressions to more psychological ones as Mithraism evolves.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you. Mikhail, I think you were the.
I go last with my question.
Yeah, I think you're next. Yeah.
Oh, can I go last?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Like a relay runner. Yeah. I think Alan, you.
It's going to be a very short question, but before I get to it, many thanks, Jason, for a really illuminating talk. I can remember as a very small boy seeing a BBC television program about the basically the discovery of the Mithras temple in London, and I was fascinated by it, and I wanted to visit the temple, but my parents, Tony, I think, once met my mother, were very staunch Methodists, and I think they put the kibosh on that for that reason. But now, 60 years, approximately 60 years later, I've learned all about a lot about Mithras. So long that it's taken. Many thanks, Jason. 60 years puzzlement has now almost been solved. But my question is very specific. A continuing reference to 7 planets. As far as I was aware, that at the time of the ancients, that we're talking about, they only knew of 5 planets, plus, of course, Earth itself. So what actually were the 7 planets?
Yeah, it's a good question. So clearly, these people did not know about Pluto or about Neptune.
Or Uranus.
Yeah, well, that's the question, because Uranus exists in Greek mythology, and Uranus figured into the Hellenistic syncretism of Greek and Persian thought. So I wonder about the extent to which Uranus may or may not have featured into this symbolism.
Yeah.
But so then there's also,
they predicted it about 1,000 years beforehand.
Yeah. So it's a good question. It's a good question.
I think Uranus was discovered in the 18th century, wasn't it?
Yeah, but see, it's a good question, because you can't say, as in the Sumerian case, where the sun and the moon are sometimes counted as planets. You can't say that in Mithraism, because Sol and Luna had very particular significance to Mithras that was distinct from the significance and influence of the planets. But it's very clearly the case that there are 7 planetary spheres. I mean, this is where we get the idea of the 7 heavens from, right? Hafta Siman in Persian. There's even basically a notion that the overpowering of Zorvan, the overcoming of Kronos, involves ascending through the 7 heavens, right? Until you're outside the celestial sphere and can grab Mithra's wheel and become master over time and fate, right? So these 7 celestial spheres are the ones ruled by these 7 planets. So yeah, it's, you're asking a very good question. I don't want to get into what some people might think of as woo-woo, highly speculative territory with the following remark, but I think there's a lot of reason to question how much ancient people knew about what. So I'm not convinced, that the ancients didn't necessarily know about Uranus. Anyway.
Excellent.
Anyway, many thanks once again, Jason. I think I'm going to be off now. So if I can just address Stead and Tony, hopefully we'll see you both online on Saturday morning.
Right, thanks a lot, Alan. Thanks.
Bye then.
Bye-bye.
And I look forward to hearing part 2, Jason.
Okay, thank you. Nick, I think you're next. If you could unmute, that's it, great.
There we go. Sorry, the screen's all moved and I suddenly couldn't click on mute. Jason, thanks for that talk. I really enjoyed it. The question I have, and I know you haven't been able to get to the Roman side of things yet with your presentation, but obviously Mithraism being a Roman mystery cult, I was just wondering how we account for a lot of the kind of information here being based on Zoroastrianism and Persian influences, when, as far as I'm aware, the only evidence for Mithraism is within Rome and the Roman Empire. There doesn't appear to be any Mithraic temples or evidence outside of the empire, especially not in Persia or Iran.
Yeah, actually, that's a huge historical fallacy. In the rest of my presentation, one of the things I do is that I point to a number of scholarly sources that I've used to reconstruct Mithraism. And there are a couple that are works of Iranology that are extremely illuminating in terms of reconstructing Parthian Mithraism and the type of Mithraism that revolted against the Sassanid state. So yes, it's true that the Sassanids came to power by destroying the various Mithraic temples and sidelining the Parthian nobility. But we have accounts from Iran itself from the various texts that have remained from the Sassanid period, royal, what do you call them? Annals, basically chronicles, okay? Royal chronicles from the Sassanid period, Zoroastrian heresiarchs' writings against Mithraists from the Sassanid period. We're able, and local histories, also Iran has a number of local histories written by people in various provinces, like in northern Iran or in Sistan, Sakastana, and so forth. And you can reconstruct from these the form that Mithraism had in the Parthian Empire before it really spread into Rome. So, the Parthians were ruling Iran for a couple of centuries before Mithraism became a dominant religious phenomenon in the Roman Empire. And when you reconstruct the form of Mithraism that was being practiced in Iran in those centuries, you can then see how certain core elements of Roman Mithraism were basically just, not imported from Iran. They were brought to Rome by the Cilician pirates and by these other agents of Mithridates and other, Parthian rulers. And then the other thing, which I had briefly mentioned, but it's worth reiterating, is that Mithraism in Iran does not die with, the Roman Empire, right? I mean, in Rome, the institutionalization of Christianity by Constantine brings about the end of Mithraism in an overt form, minus all those cryptic elements of Mithraism that are incorporated into Christianity. But Mithraism outlives the Christianization of the Roman Empire in Iran by many, many centuries. And so we see Mithraism being practiced, for example, in northern Iran in the 800s and 900s AD. The revolts against the central authority of the Arabian Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, are Mithraic in character. People like Simbad, Sonbad, and Ishaq and Mazyar Afshin, these people were Mithraists. It's very clear from the travel logs and other historical accounts, chronicles that have survived from the period of the revolts against the Caliphate, that the nature of their resistance to Sunni Islam was Mithraic. So it's a major historical fallacy, and a lot of scholarship has actually been done on this subject, not by scholars of classical Europe, but by Iranologists. And so those are sources that I'll point to in the second half of my presentation. Excellent.
Thanks very much. Is that okay, Nick? Shall I move on to the next question? Yes. Thanks for asking it. Mikhail, I think you're.
Okay, I have a very simple question, and it's even in some extent like a question for myself, but I want to share it with everyone. So because I think we use that, it's used a lot generally, like you said that the Mithra was like in the Germanic religion, Mithra was split between Tyr and Loki. And it's just an example of that. I think I've seen it, I heard it said by people more than once, and not just by you, but more people in general. And the question I'm giving to myself about this, which is in some sense theological, but from the perspective of pagan theology, is the question that can gods split if they are immortal? I don't know.
Yes, so it depends on how you understand what a god is, right? And there's various ways to do that. I mean, if you're not a materialist, which I don't think any of us here are, but if you're not a materialist, you can understand a god simply as an archetype, which is a kind of Jungian psychological approach. And if you understand a god as an archetype, then, historically, it's possible to trace how a single primordial archetype, a more archaic archetype, has then been replicated in the form of one or more subsequent archetypes that that represent dissociated elements or aspects of the more original form that it took, right? Like you can do a genealogy of archetypes and show how there are more archaic archetypes that express in a cohesive fashion elements that are later split off into two or more archetypes, right? So, you know, for example, I mean, I don't know that much, unfortunately, about Norse religion, but clearly there's a relationship between Tyr and Thor, and Tyr is the older figure, and Thor in, you know, the genealogy of Norse religion is a newer figure. And so one can understand this in terms of a transformation of archetypes. You could also understand a god as an egregore. Egregore is a Greek word that's used to designate a kind of conjured psychical entity that has archetypal characteristics, but that is not, that doesn't have conceptual abstraction. That's not simply in the realm of ideas. An egregore can be an active force in the world, right? It has a psychokinetic power. It's like a thought form that can shape events in the world through processes that, I don't know, Jung would have called synchronistic. And so if you understand a god as an egregore, well, then an egregore has a genesis, and an egregore can also disintegrate, okay? And gods can die. They can also be revived or experience rebirth, right? So there, in the history of psychical research and, you know, occultism generally, there are ways of understanding how you can reactivate a quiescent or even dead egregore, right? You can revive an egregore. So some egregores die permanently, they're dead gods. Other egregores can be revived. And if it's possible to revive an egregore, it's also possible to split an egregore in two. That if egregores are thought forms, a psychological dissociation that separates off various facets of an archetype as more than one figure, whereas they were part of a cohesive entity before, that could be reflected in the dividing of what was a single egregore into multiple egregores, two or more egregores, okay? So that's how I would say that a figure like Mithra in the archaic form might have spawned the egregore of Tyr and the egregore of Loki. And so a Mithraist would look at that phenomenon of, I guess you could call it something like, I don't know, it's like an egregoric cell division or egregoric differentiation. A Mithraist would look at that and say, this is dangerous. It's a kind of psychological dissociation that requires reintegration so that one is not assailed from out of the shadow side of one's psyche, which one has alienated oneself from, and therefore which can assail one as if it's an external enemy. Now, I think that, you know, to close this with a philosophical point and a point of comparative theology, the Norse are far less guilty of that than the Zoroastrians, because Loki is not some entirely negative demonized figure in Norse theology, whereas Ahriman, the adversarial force in Zoroastrianism, is essentially viewed as the epitome of evil, okay? So the deceptive aspect that's integrated into Norse religion in the form of Loki the trickster is completely dissociated by Zoroastrians, who see Ahriman as the god of lies and deceit. Whereas Mithra employs deceptions and stratagems, you know, in his battle for truth and justice, and is both a trickster and the god of oaths and contracts.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very, very solid answer to the question. I was thinking, Jason, whether 2 weeks hence might be suitable for you. Not next Wednesday, but the Wednesday following.
What's the date for that roughly?
That would be the 28th of April.
Is that a Wednesday?
Yeah, it's Wednesday.
I think we could do that. Yep.
Yeah, I think that seems good. I think it's good for us to meet fairly soon after now. Whilst the ideas are still present.
Absolutely.
One good thing is that I will be uploading this evening's Moot to the YouTube channel, so we can all see it again, because there were so many points made that I found it difficult to grasp them all, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. I think looking at the time, we're sort of approaching about sort of 2 hours. I think with that philosophical answer might be a good time to end this Moot. And I mean, thanks so much for giving of your time and your energy and to have created such a powerful presentation with so many slides. So I'll just say a few words in Old Norse, blow out the candle, and we can say our goodbyes. Ad quelli skal da gloifa, kono brende maki roinde moi givin ise kemmer, ul drukkide og agnot skal kvöldloifa. Sigur os, frido os. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks everyone who came and contributed questions. And let's hope we can all meet again 2 weeks from now and continue this fascinating story. And one that's got so many dimensions to it that I hadn't realized, but it is a great topic. So thanks very much, Jason. Yeah, we'll be in touch, but we should see one another on the 28th.
Thank you again, Stead, and I look forward to seeing you all again on the 28th.
You will.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care for now.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye now.